And so thank you, Magda. I'm not going to be talking too much about the direct compositional part of my research program, which I think is the most important part. But within that, I'm going to be talking about this notion of variable-free semantics, and I will mention direct compositionality as part of it. I mean, the idea of direct compositional semantics, it may be unusual now. It certainly was not when I grew up. It was actually sort of inspired by Montague grammar, and in the 80s, it was sort of, everyone assumed it was the desiderata, even if not, couldn't be quite right, everybody wanted it to be. And it's just the idea that the syntax builds expressions or proves them well formed, and in tandem the semantics interprets them, giving meaning from the whole, the meaning from the parts, and that's all there is. So there's the syntax building or proving expressions well formed, and the semantics mapping those to a meaning in tandem, and therefore no extra levels of representation like LF, nothing. The syntax maps to another level, which is then compositionally interpreted. Okay. But within that, I'm interested, and the two ideas of variable-free semantics and direct compositionality don't have to go hand in hand, but they sort of naturally do for reasons I probably won't have time to say much about today, but we'll talk about that later if anyone's interested. So what my agenda is for today is first to sort of introduce the idea of variable-free semantics and give a very quick tour, very quick through the basic idea and some of the theoretical advantages. And then I want to focus on one new application I've been working on lately, an empirical advantage. By the way, I think that there's many empirical advantages. And most of my papers for, boy, I don't know, I started this work in 1991, so that's like almost 30 years. Right, oh, yeah. Spell out a lot of empirical advantages, and that's what I'm going to put together in this book that Magda mentioned. But meanwhile, I have a kind of annotated bibliography that I put together recently, pulling all these results together, and I've given you the URL on the handout in case anybody wants to look at this annotated bibliography. Okay, but I'm not going to talk too much about other things today. I just want to give one case study, which is actually, I think, in some ways more tentative than some of my other results, but it's one that I'm interested in working more on. So first, let me say, just review the standard view of pronouns and binding, what has become standard in a lot of linguistics literature, which assumes that each pronoun contains an index, and an index pronoun functions like a variable. This makes crucial use of assignment functions, which are functions that assign values to the variable names, or equivalently directly to the index pronouns. It doesn't really much matter. That in turn means that all meanings are relative to assignments, and any expression that has no unbound pronoun within it still can be seen as relative to assignments, but it's a constant function, so all assignments are given the same value. But if you have an unbound pronoun like a pronoun itself, like he, so oh, by the way, I apologize, I don't know what happened to the subscripts. This is the same program I've used forever. And all these subscripts got like shrunk into you need a microscope to look at them, but hopefully they'll be clear from the context what they should be. So if you had a pronoun like he sub I, whatever that I is, then on any assignment G, it's whatever value G assigns to X sub I, or directly to I. It could assign it directly to the integers. Okay, all that's kind of gone in the variable-free program. So the variable-free program has been around in various forms for a long time. This is not my direct inspiration, but I did read about this paper by Quine when I was in graduate school called Variables Explained Away, and I thought, oh, wow, that's kind of cool. And then when I started working on variable-free semantics, I realized, oh, that's what Quine was doing. So he's certainly somebody to cite this 1966 paper of his. Combinatory logic of Curry and Phase is a variable-free kind of logic. And a lot of the sort of variable-free ideas have been around in work in categorical grammar, and especially a lot of the work in the 90s. It's inspired my own work on pushing the program to, I think, its logical conclusion. So work by Steve Mitsubishi-Dowdy and many others. The idea of this is that there's no variables in the semantics, and hence no assignment functions, and no indices in the syntax. So I will use indices on this handout and variables, but these are for notation purposes only. I'm using indices only to indicate the intended readings. They're not part of the grammar. And I'm using variables only in the notation because I'm putting things in lambda notation. One could do this in a variable-free notation if I wrote these things out in combinatorial logic, except that nobody in the world can read them except Ed Keenan claims he can. Fancy, fancy, fancy formulas. He claims to be a native speaker of combinatorial logic, but I have not met others. So, variables are there for the notation, but they're always bound, so they're not really there. So the idea is that any expression which contains an unbound pronoun, in the sort of informal sense of unbound, we all know what that means, or an extraction site within it, is actually a function from individuals to whatever type you thought it had if it didn't have any unbound pronouns within it. If it's two unbound pronouns, it's a function from two individuals and so forth. It doesn't have to be because they could be kind of merged, but I will just be looking at cases with one pronoun for most of this. So that means his mother really just means the mother of function. It's the function mapping each individual into their mother. And there's no indices there. Something like she lost is just the same function as lost. Okay. Modulo the contribution of gender, I think it's actually a function defined only for the domain of female individuals or whatever the she stand for, but I'm just going to ignore the gender contribution here. And as I said, the variables are there in the notation only. Pronouns themselves are just the identity function on individuals. So, how does the system work to allow, say, a pronoun to fill a kind of normal argument slot? If you have, how do we get he lost to just mean lost? After a loss is of type ET, what's an individual? How does it get to combine with something of type EE, the identity function? And quite crucially, I make a lot of crucial use of this in a lot of places in my work. There's a lot of what I call unary rules. So this is all implemented in a categorical grammar syntax. And in my book, I have a whole very extensive fragment with a full explicit syntax and semantics. The book's not about variable-free semantics, but does have a chapter on that. But where I sort of merge the syntax, it's about direct compositionality. I'm not going to do the syntax here for lack of time. I'll just do the semantics. But basically, there's a syntactic and a semantic component to what I'm about to do. The idea is there are rules. They often go in the standard literature under the rubric of type shift rules, but just think of them as unary rules. They take a linguistic expression, which is a triple of sound, category, meaning, and map it to a new expression, sound, category, meaning. The ones of interest here are the ones that don't actually have any phonological effect. And these are the things that have been called type shift rules. And so in particular, a verb like lost, which is of type ET, can undergo this Geach rule, as it's called. Geach? Oh, something got missed on the handout I write. G is just a unary curried version of function composition. G of f of h is just is f composed with h. I think I may have written that in the wrong direction. It's h composed with f. But basically, what it means is if you have a function of any type, a function from A type things to B type things, you can map it into a function from C to A's to C to B's, and that C in completeness is sort of passed up. And so what that does is it takes loss, which is of type ET, and maps it into something of type EE, ET. So now it's very happy to combine with his mother, say, which is the mother of function of type EE, or she, which is the identity function. And what you get back if you work through the derivations and the lambda conversions and so forth, if you essentially apply this new thing to the identity function, you get back lost. Another way to put that is if you function compose loss with the identity function, you get back lost. Because the Geach rule is just sort of teasing function composition off into two steps. It's a curried version of function composition. Okay, so if we have something like Mary likes him, likes him, just to mention this, likes him is going to, gets to combine with a pronoun in the same way by undergoing this rule, which I won't walk through. But likes him is now the same as likes. You might think when that combines with Mary, we'd get a disastrous result, that Mary would sort of fill the object slot. Once this is wedded with a categorical grammar syntax, there is no problem. Mary combines it in other ways, and you get Mary likes him ends up being the function from individuals to the propositions that Mary likes that individual. Okay. Again, there is no problem, but since I don't have time to walk you through the syntax, you sort of just have to take my word for it. read it in any of my papers, or it's sort of also mapped out the textbook. Okay, so how do we get binding? How do we get something like one every third grade boy called his mother on the so-called bound reading? By the way, there's no notion in the grammar here of binding. This is just informal terminology because we all know what it means. If you look at the standard theory, that's true. If you look at a standard way, there's no notion of the grammar of binding. There's kind of a notion of lambda abstraction, which sort of maps open sentences into closed properties. And that's kind of the binding step. The grammar doesn't need to know anything about binding. But I'll continue to use that terminology because we all know it's convenient. So how do we get something like every third grade boy called his mother to have the meaning we want when that his is so-called bound by every third grade boy? And here I make use of one other unary or type shift rule. Everybody needs an extra step for binding. The standard way is to sort of have lambda abstraction happen. Here, one of the big differences is it happens much more locally. The sort of binding part happens more locally. And it's an operation on the verb call, which I call Z. And I'm giving it in simplified form here for exposition. It needs to be generalized for cases of three-place verbs and so forth. And I have those generalizations in various papers of mine, but I'll give the simple version here. So if you have any function which is from A's to E to T's, that maps it into Z of alpha, which is now a function that wants something. And here that impossible to read subscript is a bit disastrous. That's lambda f of type EA. That is a function from E's into A's, lambda x call f of x. In other words, to give it informally, to Z call now wants a function of type EE in its object, rather than an individual. And to Z call some function f is simply to be an x who calls f of x. So call his mother, once you've done Z on call, and you apply that to his mother, which is the mother function, you get the set of x's who are self-mother's callers. And then for something like every third grade boy called his mother, that set of self-mother callers is taken as argument of the generalized quantifier every third grade boy. It's exactly as in standard theory at that point. We can contrast a little bit with the standard theory here to see the sort of direct compositional view of it. You can do this directly compositionally with variables. Partee did in the sort of derived VP rule idea. But the more common way in most work nowadays is to imagine that what happens in order to get this binding is there's a level of logical form. The every third grade boy is pulled out, leaves a trace. So we get this sort of T sub I called his sub I's mother. Or let's index it with 8, because that's what I've done on the handout. T sub 8 calls his sub 8's mother. That is an open sentence. It's an open proposition. It's relative to assignment functions. That then undergoes this lambda abstraction thing, which maps it into the property of being a self-mother caller. It maps it into the set of x's such that x called their own mothers by this lambda abstraction step, which I've indicated in a sort of Hyman-Kratzer type fashion, making the integer the sister of that node there. That's still relative to assignment functions, but since all the variables are now bound, it yields the same property on all assignment functions, and then that's taken as argument of every third grade boy, exactly as in the last few steps of what I gave you in the variable-free program. But I hope you can see the point that the variable-free program is sort of direct compositional. We didn't need to pull things out. The other funny thing about the standard way to think about binding, you sort of pull things out and you leave a trace which corresponds to a variable. So, and the pronoun also corresponds to a variable. Then you smash out the variables by lambda abstracting over them. Once you bind them, they don't really play any role anymore. So first you sort of create this variable, and in movement terms too, like in relative clauses, you move something, you leave something that corresponds to a variable, you get up here, you lambda abstract it over, whoops, the variable doesn't do anything anymore. In this thing, everything's direct compositional. You never had a variable. You just have everything what I call healthy model theoretic objects. So maybe at this point I can pause and say something that's not on the handout. One of what I think is the advantages of this program is what assignment functions are weird. It's fine to have things be true or false relative to worlds and to times. But I find it wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to say things are true or false relative to an assignment function, a way to assign values to the variables. These are not what I call healthy model theoretic objects. There are times out there. There are possible worlds out there. I'll go out on a limb and say that. There are possible worlds out there. There are times. There is all that stuff. But variables and assignment functions, at least one might argue, are kind of a trick to get things to work. They're not I don't think the grammar gods gave them to us. At least you could argue about that. So you don't have them in this program. There isn't this sort of level of these assignment functions and variables, which then get bound and don't really do anything anymore. So that's the kind of theoretical advantage. And we don't need any rules of LF, and we can just directly compositionally put things together. Of course, there's many challenges to this view, and I've been spending 30 years or so trying to answer those challenges. In this simple little toy example, anyway, everything comes out free, comes out really well. What happens if it's a free pronoun, and here you've got to pull on your best microscope and read that the third grade boy has the index I and his has the index J. I just mean this to be a pronoun that's not bound by every third grade boy, where his at the end of the day picks up a contextually salient individual. In this case, what happens is that every third grade boy, call his mother is the function lambda x, call x's mother. It's the function from individuals to the set of things that call that individual's mother. How does that combine with every third grade boy when we don't have the binding? Every third grade boy is generalized quantifier. It will undergo this each rule. And that allows, and again, by the way, I want to do this whole thing quite informally, and I hope that's not going to make things more confusing, but I think trying to slog through formal details just takes a lot of time. You can work through these on your own. If you teach this every third grade boy, in fact, in general, whenever pronouns, unbound pronouns are being passed up, they basically correspond to open argument slots. And that keeps getting passed up by whatever they're combining with, undergoing this each rule, which says, give me an incomplete thing, and I'll inherit the incompleteness. And so at the end of the day, every third grade boy called his mother is not a proposition. It's a function from individuals to the proposition that every third grade boy called the mother of that individual. And that's where the semantic stops. It delivers not a T-type expression, but an ET-type expression. Then the listener is responsible for applying this to a contextually salient individual. And many people look at the variable-free program and say, that's not a sentence, that's not a proposition. That's not a proposition in the standard theory either. It's a function from assignment functions to propositions. You have to pick an assignment function to get that to be something. I'd rather pick an individual, contextually salient individual, than a contextually salient assignment function, but that's me being dogmatic. I don't see that there's any downside here. Okay. So that's the background on variable-free semantics. Now I want to show some interesting applications to ellipsis. So I don't know how many people in this audience are not linguists, so I know. Okay, good. Fine. So I'm going to give some background on ellipsis that linguists probably know, although they're not going to agree with all of it anyway, but I want this to be accessible. So VP ellipsis is like the thing in 4. Lindsay can ski that course in 4 minutes, but Bodhi can't. The strike-through material here is not, I am not following a common line of saying it's really there, you just don't hear it. Once again, I'm giving this just to indicate the sort of obvious understanding of this sense. In fact, it's context dependent. There's plenty of context you can dream up where that stuff after can't is understood in other ways. But without any prior context, this out of the blue, this wouldn't be uttered out of the blue, but in the most obvious context that you could think of, we would understand this as saying Bodhi can't ski that course in 4 minutes. So there's actually 2 main theories about ellipsis and a lot of variants of them. One, which is by far the dominant theory, is that the strike-through material really is there at some level. The grammar allows it to be unpronounced or deleted. Under identity with some other overt linguistic material, here the overt material, ski that course in 4 minutes that you get in the Lindsay clause. And within that view, there's about huge amounts of debate about how to implement that and what the identity condition is, and this has gone on for decades. Let me assume for the purposes of this talk that if that were correct, which I don't think it is, that the condition would be under semantic identity with some other VP, and that's fairly commonly accepted nowadays, although not entirely by any means. But anyway, there's some kind of identity condition allowing something to be unpronounced because it's been said before. It's basically the sort of received wisdom. The other wisdom, which goes back at least as early as Hart's dissertation, although I think it's around in earlier things too, and I've been arguing for it in a number of papers, is there's really nothing there. And this is much like a free variable, quote unquote. Well, I don't have variables, so how can I be trained on a free variable, but I'll tell you that in a second. In other words, there's really nothing there. The listener simply picks up a contextually salient property, i.e. a function of type ET, which is the right sort of thing to be the combined with the auxiliary. And the reason we think of there being an antecedent is because, for reasons I'll come to in a second, it likes to be made salient by having been named, the property that you pick up. It likes to be salient by it being the meaning of overt linguistic material. Okay, but it doesn't have to be. So in variable-free semantics, since there's no free variables, something like Bodhi can't is really a function from ET type meanings to say P of type ET to the proposition that Bodhi can't P. Okay, and then pick up. It's a function looking for some kind of property. You pick up the property, ski that course in 4 minutes because it's just been mentioned. That, of course, goes against common wisdom that was started in Hankemer and Sogg 1976, who claimed the opposite. They claimed that you can't get VP ellipsis with no overt linguistic antecedent. But they're wrong, and we all know they're wrong. And it's been known they're wrong since 1976 plus a month or something. There have been illions of examples, counterexamples in the literature showing that you can get this without any overt antecedent. It's just hard. So a recent paper by Miller and Pullum, who gives some actual corpus data of cases without, and other people have come up with these too. The example I especially like of theirs was suggested. It's not an actually naturally occurring one. It was suggested by a referee. But it's the following scenario. Fred is filthy, and this is just taken directly from their paper. Fred is filthy and has passed out on the sidewalk. Tom and Bob recognize him. Tom looks at Bob and taps his forearm twice, clearly suggesting the possibility of intravenous drug use. And Bob says, does he really? And that's fine. That goes through pretty smoothly. And you can construct these things really quite easily. There's cases like you and I are taking a hike on a very hot day, and we see a nice pool that would require us to jump into, and we look at each other and think, I will if you will. There are lots of cases like that. The question is, why are they almost right? Why were Hankemer and Sogg right enough that people have continued to believe it for all these gazillions of years? It's true that these contrast with ordinary free pronouns, an example I always like from a paper of Lasnik's in Linguistic Analysis, I think 1979, but I can't find it on his website, and I couldn't get the reference to it even though I know the paper quite well, but I don't have it in my office. But anyway, Lasnik's point was you can get free pronouns without overt material, so you're at a party and there's this obnoxious guy, walks in, nobody likes him, nobody talks to him, nobody mentions his name, he walks out, and I turn to you and say, oh, thank goodness he left. And that's totally smooth. So why are those cases where we have a free individual pronoun so much smoother than the ones where we have a free ET type pronoun as in the VP ellipsis? What I'd like to say, and this is going to be quite crucial actually to the stuff I want to talk about later in this talk, is that it's because it's easier to access individuals from context. We look at them, we pick them up, we put them under our pillow, and so forth. And events too, if anybody wants to talk about do it, we can come back to that at the end. But functions of type ET are what I call more fragile objects. It's just harder to kind of conjure them up out of the discourse context, which is why they like to be made salient by having just been named by a previous VP. So I'm saying that the previous VP, the notion of an antecedent, the grammar has no notion of a grammatical antecedent. That's an illusion of the fact that you've got this thing that likes to name the property. And an extension of this that I'm going to be talking about is that the more complex the type, the more difficult to access. I call this homemade psycholinguistics. I'm not a psycholinguist, and I'd love to work with a psycholinguist to try to really get some evidence for this hunch. But I think it's at least reasonable as a first pass. So what we should be looking at, rather than trying to get the right identity conditions on VP ellipsis, what we should be asking really is, what does it take to make things sufficiently salient? That would be the project, rather than going around circles on the identity condition. And a point I've been making in a number of papers is, as long as these cases with no linguistic antecedent exist, everybody has to explain why they're hard to get. So there's no extra burden on the theory that says that's what's going on in all cases. Okay, just one more background piece, so-called sloppy identity, noticed originally by Ross. Known for years it's not really sloppy, but if you have something like, every third grade boy called his mother, but no fourth grade boy did, meaning called the mother of the fourth grade boy. As you can see, the way this works here is that call his mother in the first clause is to Z call the mother function. And then no fourth grade boy did is just directly picking up Z call the mother function, and you get the so-called sloppy identity where what is understood as no fourth grade boy called his own mother. That's pretty much the same as in the standard view. This way of thinking of so-called sloppy identity goes back to Keenan 71. But actually, it comes out cleaner in this view than in certain ways to think about ellipses. So I won't go into that, but it's perfectly straightforward. It comes out very clean. So we're just picking up Z call the mother of the mother function. Okay, now to some stuff that I think is newer, and then sort of an application of this, and then I want to get to the sort of punchline part. So it turns out that within the way I've sort of set up the mechanism for ellipsis, it follows that there ought to be missing two place relations that get picked up by contextual salience, just like missing properties as the VP ellipsis cases. And these are the cases that I've called transitive verb phrase ellipsis, just as a name, and that have gone under the rubric of rebinding in much of the standard literature. I'm going to skip 7 because that's a perfectly interesting case of it, but just to save some time, I'll skip that. So the background on this, and again, I don't have time to tell you the exact syntax of how this is all put together and why we would expect these, but I have that mapped out in several papers, some of which are in the bibliography here. Let me go back, step back in time. I keep time warping here. That's because I'm very old. So I'm stepping back in time to Sog's dissertation in 1976. And he looked at the following sentences. Well, he wasn't that prescient. He didn't know about Harris and Warren. But the type of sentence that he looked at would be something like A. Harris is hoping that South Carolina will seal the nomination for her. And Warren is 2. Now, that can have a sloppy reading. That is, Warren is hoping that South Carolina will go for Warren. Okay? But he noticed that something like 8B, where he had what he called little ellipsis, where there's an ellipsis down low, it's difficult at best to get the sloppy reading. You could argue about whether it's possible at all, but it's difficult. So his examples, of course not his exact examples, but like this were, Harris is hoping that South Carolina will seal the nomination for her, and Warren is also hoping that it will. It's very difficult to read that on any reading other than the one where Warren is hoping, very strangely, I don't know why she would, but Warren is hoping that Harris will carry South Carolina. That's the strict reading. So Sog made a big deal about how this big ellipsis is possible, not the little ellipsis. Now there's a story he could have told. It's not the story he did tell, but it's close to the story he told. It's the story he should have told. So basically, the almost Sog story is this, that the A case is good because Her is bound within the meaning of the matrix VP, that's the antecedent, the Harris clause. So this is, Harris is an X, such that X is hoping that South Carolina will seal the nomination for X. And you get that binding of the matrix VP whether you're doing a variable-free semantics or not, whether you're doing, I mean, in various theories you get that. That's what I just said about my story. That's not the endemic, it's pretty much the standard. Okay. So that's bound within that. But if you look at the Harris is hoping that South Carolina will seal the nomination for her, Harris her, and Warren is also hoping that it will seal it for Warren her, and you look at what's missing in the lower part, it's seal the nomination for her sub j, and that would correspond to the variable x sub j. And now we're back to variable land. So one way you could look at this in the standard theory is that these two are not semantically equivalent. Seal the nomination for her sub I is not the same as seal the nomination for her sub j, because those pronouns are open, they have different indices. On any assignment function g, it is not the case necessarily that g of I will be the same as g of j. So until they're bound, free variables with different indices are different semantic objects. Okay? And so if you need semantic identity, this is not semantically identical to the antecedent VP. If you have a theory where you're needing an antecedent with semantic identity. Okay. So remember, as long as the variable is not bound, then if there's different indices, they're different things. To make that story work, however, you need a constraint, which has since been called in the literature no meaningless co-indexation. Because there's no reason, given normal conventions of indices and binding, where both the Harris pronoun and the Warren pronoun could happen to have been her sub I, and they get bound separately. That is, if you just look, there'd be nothing to stop Harris sub I is hoping that South Carolina will seal the nomination for her sub I, and Warren sub I is hoping that it'll seal the nomination for Warren sub I. And they each get bound separately. But they look semantically alike, even though they're bound by different things. What Saad did was have them be different, but have a whole condition on they can't be. I won't go through his condition, it was very complex. The simplest one would be this idea of no meaningless co-indexation. Every binder has a unique index. If they're bound by different things, they have to have different indices. That would be the simple way to block these. However, if you really believe in variables and indexation, you shouldn't be happy with no meaningless co-indexation. It's an extra stipulation. It doesn't follow from the general program with variables. It doesn't follow from the general conventions of indices, and you have to kind of have a kind of global look at things and say each binder has to have an index distinct from any other binder, and this is really rather a complication in grammar that you shouldn't be happy with. Okay. So that doesn't look like the right way to account for Saag's facts. So keep that in mind, and we'll come back to that. But in any case, it turned out that Saag's facts were wrong. So it has since come to the attention of many people that there are many cases where you do get cases of an elided material, and I'll try to put kind of theory neutral terms, where if there was a pronoun, it would be bound by something different from what binds in the antecedent. And so one of the first cases I know was a student of mine at an ESCOL paper in '88, where he had something like bagels I like, donuts I don't. And if you have those as traces there, there's the bagel trace and the donuts trace. This is smooth as silk, this case. But you get the sort of sloppy reading or whatever. There are different traces bound differently. He also had cases like I know which student Pauline recommended and which student Sheila did. Sheila was my colleague at the time, and Frederick was a student in our department. Actually, Saad had cases like this, which he thought were bad, but he had them as main clause cases. And there was a confound because the subject box inversion got in the way. So these are good. I had cases in '92 in a SALT paper that went like this. Sue and Mary are both going on vacation. They each need people to water their plants. It's fine to say, Sue asked Bill to water her plants and Mary asked John to, meaning Mary asked John to water Mary's plants. These are good. You've got this ellipsis of water her plants, which in variable-free terms is the two-place relation holding between x and y such that x waters y's plants, the water the plants of relation. In standard terms, you've got water her plants with a different index on that her as the other her. Yeah, you could say They can have the same index accidentally, but then you don't account for the original SOGFACS. So there are cases, the point is there are cases, these are like the cases that SOG thought were bad. And it's easy to construct them. Other cases that have been called rebinding, I'm just going to mention these. Remember, these are all cases where what I'm claiming is, since there's this kind of unbound pronoun within the meaning of the antecedent, water, her, plants, that denotes a two-place relation, and that's what's picked up at the ellipsis site. I didn't really make that clear on the handout, but hopefully that's clear. Other cases like that are more complex that I talked about in 92, something like 13, I had stupid kissing scenarios, and so I'm getting rid of kissing scenarios. Professor Carberry, that's Brown. That's kind of a Brown internal joke. Our mascot is Professor Josiah Carberry, who's professor of psychoceramics, i.e. cracked pots. So there's lots of I have some funny scenarios about Carberry in my book. So Professor Carberry nominated several students to be in the pot-making competition, but none of them really wanted him to. Wanted Carberry to. None of them wanted Carberry to nominate them, which is actually, the two-place relation nominate. That's what's missing there. Now, how the combinatorics puts that all together, I kind of gave a little sketch of on the handout, and I don't think it's really worth going through that. We could come back to that in the question period if anybody wants. Basically, what happens is the way the whole combinatorics is put together, none of them really want him to can be interpreted as a function from two-place relations are, I have it at the bottom line here, to the proposition that none of the students Z-want Z-want to be an X such that Carberry R's X. I don't know if that helps to put it that way. That in turn is the same as, it's a function from two-place relations R to the proposition that none of the students are Y's who want Y to, want Carberry to stand in the R relation to Y. And then it picks up the contextually salient nominate relation, which has been named in the clause before. So this is just like an extension of the story on VP ellipsis, but you could pick up these salient two-place relations. And all the cases that have gone under in the sort of syntactic semantics literature under the rubric of rebinding are just that. There's nothing special about them. They didn't deserve a special name. Jason Merchant discovered these later in 2001 and gave them the name rebinding. Evans and I and other people who looked at these earlier just didn't give them a name because they sort of was nothing special about them. They were totally to be expected. If this is right, and this is just like other cases of VP ellipsis, we also ought to be able to get these sort of missing two-place relations without any overt linguistic context. And indeed we can. I had some examples in one of my papers where I'm baking a batch of cookies and they come out of the oven and little Susie wants the cookies and she starts, I have a cool batch that's already out of the oven and I pull the hot batch out and she goes to grab one from the plate I just took out and I say, those you can't, these you can't, at least not until they cool down. So can't, what? Can't eat, can't grab that, can't take, whatever. It's a missing two-place relation, totally smooth. Nothing weird about that context. Similar one that I had because I wanted to just get a sort of slightly different type of context is what I call the me either scenario. So here's Dad with two kids, Keela and Zach. Keela is the older one, and she's been trying to tell Dad for quite a while that she's very independent and she doesn't need any help tying her shoes anymore. But, Dad is a creature of habit, and so he reaches down to start helping Keela, and she says, Dad, please stop. I don't want you to. Okay, that part's fine. What's missing there is, there's a couple ways to analyze that, but there it could just be tying her shoelaces, okay? But then, the key point is Zach. So Zach is younger than Keela, and he's kind of a copycat. He likes to copy Keela. So Dad then reaches down to help Zach, and Zach says, and I don't want you to either. That could mean he doesn't want her Dad to tie Keela's shoes, But the context I'm interested in is the one where it's easily interpreted as, I don't want you to tie my shoes. And so that's a kind of a sloppy reading there. And when I gave a sort of version of this, because I talked about this at SALT last year, at Brown, Scott Anderbois had some objection that, are we sure that's really bound or whatever? So I could make an even more complex case, supposing there's 3 more kids, and, you know, Dad keeps trying to tie somebody's shoelace. I don't want to be obsolete. And finally, one of the kids says, Dad, don't you get it? None of us want you to. And that clearly has this sort of bound, sloppy reading. What's missing? The 2-place relation, tie the shoelaces of. And so this can easily be understood as, let me just go back to Zach's. It's missing a 2-place relation. It picks up a 2-place relation, but it's R. It's a function from 2-place relations R to the proposition that I don't Z want you to R. And since R is the tie the shoelaces of, it turns out that I don't want you to be in, I don't want to be an X such that you tie the shoelaces of X. And so you've got this missing 2-place relation. The binding of the sort of object position of the tie the shoelaces of is because of the Z on want. And the other kids can be saying the same thing. So these are okay without any prior linguistic antecedent. Now, why have these been even less noticed? There's a lot of literature on the cases of VP ellipsis without prior antecedent. There's no literature that I'm aware of other than my own, and maybe I'm wrong here, but where people have constructed cases of missing 2-place relations with no prior antecedent. And what I'd like to speculate again, and again, I am now putting on this homemade psycholinguistics hat. What I'd like to speculate is because missing 2-place relations, that's an even more complex type than ETs. So trying to pick up out of the blue EETs, you need a lot of contextual support. And that's why I went to this whole Keela and Zach scenario. So again, I think the real question to ask is, what does it take to make these things contextually salient? And that's sort of above my pay grade. But I think that's what we should be asking about these so-called ellipsis cases. So my hypothesis, which is going to be crucial in the next part that's coming up, is that the more complex the type, the harder it is to access out of the blue. And that's why these missing 2-place relations have been even less noticed than the missing ET-type functions. Okay, that was all a bit of a digression. That leaves us, okay, fine, there's these cases with missing 2-place relations, but what about the original SOG effect? That's a real effect. I think his facts were correct, although they're very delicate, and once in a while I think to myself, maybe they're just wrong altogether. But I think the SOG facts are right. So that gets us back to the question of why. Why do we get this effect? So let's go back to look at the good cases versus the bad cases. Let me first sort of spill the beans a little bit, which is that Takahashi and Fox in a SALT paper 2005 say that, you know, it has something to do with the fact that in the cases where there's a little ellipsis, there could have been a higher ellipsis, which in turn derives from an idea that Merchant had in some other work of what's called MaxElide, that there's some principle that says elide as big as you can. And I'll come back to why I don't think that's quite the right way to look at it. But I think they're right that the difference between the good cases that, like I constructed and that Evans constructed and that Merchant later constructed and so forth, is that of these missing smaller ellipsis or TVP ellipsis, is there's no competition with a bigger ellipsis. So if you look at the Harris and Warren, South Carolina cases, notice that 8B competes directly with 8A. You know, there could have been this higher ellipsis. In 11, what's the difference? That's a good one. This is not, I didn't give this case earlier, but it's like my plant watering case. Harris is hoping that South Carolina will seal the nomination for her, while Warren is hoping that New Hampshire will. And that's good on the sloppy reading, which is seal the nomination for her, Warren. That's like my plant case. And there's no higher possible ellipsis because the subjects are different. One is South Carolina and the other is New Hampshire. So there's no competition. Or you could compare Sue asked Bill to water her plants and Mary asked Sam to. That was my good case, which much worse, the SOG type case would be Sue asked Bill to water her plants, and Mary also asked him to, meaning water her plants. Mary's plants, that's worse. Okay. So what Takahashi and Fox have argued is they related to this independent proposal from Merchant, and I won't go through their actual proposal because that would take too long, and I have it in kind of an appendix on the handout. But basically they say that essentially it's this competition, it's this MaxElide, higher ellipsis if possible. And that's why the SOG examples of this little ellipsis are bad because there was a possible higher ellipsis. The other types of examples are good because there is no possible higher ellipsis because you've got different subjects and clauses. Okay, and they relate it to this earlier principle proposed by Merchant of MaxElide. My own account also extends to the original MaxElide cases that Merchant was concerned with, and I think I'll just leave that for the question period if anyone wants, because there's a recent paper by Griffiths and LI who had an entirely different explanation for those cases, and I think he's right. So in a sense, I think those are red herrings. But still, it looks like MaxElide is a good contender to explain the SOG facts. Okay, problems and questions with this. Another sort of small little line of work I have every once in a while is arguing against grammatically based competition, which is terribly unpopular now because all these economy-driven things are about grammatically based competition. But if you think about it, it's kind of complex because the grammar has to compute not just a derivation, but a set of derivations and check them out against each other. So it's a really complicated thing. And this was sort of demonstrated in a lot of detail in a paper by Johnson and Lapp in LNP in '97, the sort of complexities of having the grammar compute a set of derivations. Moreover, those that have been proposed are usually some notion of simplicity or economy, and MaxElide, the biggest thing, has nothing to do with simplicity or economy. It's just sort of a principle that's out there. That point has been made by other people too. So, that brings me to the sort of why should size matter? I would like to think that competition effects, when they do exist, are about speakers and hearers. Again, I'm not a psycholinguist, so I don't really know how this happens, but we kind of do know that speakers and hearers do compute alternative ways of saying things. If you have any belief in any of the fundamentals of Gricean pragmatics, it's based on having computed a competition. You didn't say all, so you must not be able to say all. You didn't say am, so you must not be able to say am. So listeners and speakers are computing competition. Blocking effects are this too. We compute competition effects all the time. I'd like to think we're smart, we can do it. I like to think grammars are dumb. I don't want to give them that computational burden. We have to give it to ourselves because it's there. Okay, so it would be nice when there are competition-based effects to say it has something to do with speakers and hearers rather than grammatical things. Now, MaxElide saying elide as big as possible, it's not implausible to say that's a principle about speaker ease, right? Because it's saying be as lazy as possible. If you can get away with saying less, do so. So don't do a smaller ellipsis when you could have done a bigger ellipsis because you're lazy. And that would be fine. And in fact, there's psycholinguistic literature on what's called the repeated name penalty, which is sort of reminiscent of this. And of course, we know there are things in language that are motivated by articulatory ease, I assume. I assume we still believe that assimilation rules are about articulatory ease, though I haven't kept up with modern phonology. Is that right? Any phonologists here? We still assume that there's articulatory. So, we can't assume that there are principles of speaker laziness. But that can't really be right on this size story for the following reason. First of all, ellipsis should always be preferred then over non-ellipsis, and it isn't. So let's talk about a context of a discussion of a nomination to the Supreme Court. I could say Lindsay voted for him and Susan did too. Let's say we're talking about Kavanaugh. But I could also say Lindsay voted for him and Susan voted for him too. There's really nothing wrong with the non-ellipsis one. It's certainly not bad the way the SOG facts are bad. The reverse of that problem is actually going to come up for my account, so I just want to give fair warning. I'm not out of the woods on that. But my account would predict that there should never be ellipsis. But I think that the thing about always ellipsis, never ellipsis, is a tension between hearer ease and speaker ease. And so it's possible to not elide, it's possible to elide, and that's the tension between hearer and speaker is resolved somehow. More seriously, though, the effect in these kinds of cases, and this was noticed by Takahashi and Fox, and also later by Merchant was discussed, the MaxElide competition that we're looking at in the SA cases holds only when the elided material or the missing material, in my terms, the material whose meaning supplies the missing meaning, contains a pronoun or trace unbound within it. And again, Takahashi and Fox noticed these facts. So if you have something like, Bodhi thought that Lindsay would win gold and Sally also did is good. But it's also fine to say Bodhi thought that Lindsay would win gold and Sally also thought she. That should be a she. I got my Lindsays confused. The Lindsay, the Senator Lindsay from the other sentence crept into to become a skier in the sentence. So that's Lindsay Vaughn, and that's a she. So Bodhi thought that Lindsay would win gold and Sally also thought she would. That's perfectly good. I mean, maybe it's a little better to prefer the higher ellipsis, but it's a mild effect. So in general, MaxElide doesn't hold there. It holds only when there's an unbound pronoun within the sort of lower ellipsis case, or, in my terms, within the meaning that's applying the two-place relation. Okay? So, to be fair, Takahashi and Fox try to derive this from general facts claims about the conditions on ellipsis. They give a whole definition of where ellipsis can happen, and they try to derive that from that. I won't go through what they do there, but I will say that at the end of the day, their account still requires no meaningless co-indexation. It doesn't work without no meaningless co-indexation. So it's a long discussion. I have a kind of informal discussion in the appendix part of the handout, but it only works still if there's no meaningless co-indexation, because they have to make sure that the antecedents to the ellipsis, and in their terms the ellipsis thing, which is really there, don't have pronouns with the same indices on them, because then they're semantically equivalent, and then you should be able to get the ellipsis no matter what is going on higher. Okay, so what I want to say is I think Takahashi and Fox are absolutely right about the reason the SA cases were bad, whereas if you switch the subjects of the next clause up, it's good, then it has to do with competition. But as I've said, for them to implement it so that it only gets that competition when you have an unbound pronoun within the so-called ellipsis site is a certain, they require, I think, a fairly complicated mechanism. And there's still no clear reason why size should matter. It doesn't follow from anything that there's this MaxElide pressure. To elide, when you've got this competition in a certain case, elide the bigger thing. And as I said, we can't pin that on a lazy speaker because that should hold in a much broader range of cases. But let's think about what's happening here. The little ellipsis cases are picking up two-place relations. The big ellipsis case is picking up a property, an ET, okay? And in fact, the generalization that you get this in standard terms only when there's an unbound pronoun within the elided material means that it's one more level complicated. It's a more complicated function. So now, what I'd like to say, the competition story is correct, but size doesn't matter, types do. And so the competition is because in the competition cases, we've got a missing EET meaning, and in the better cases, so that's the SOG cases, in the other cases we've got a missing ET meaning, because it's bound within, the unbound pronoun down here is bound within the meaning of the upper ET. And now, if that's the case, we can certainly tell a plausible story that relocates this as a speaker-hearer-based principle, which is be good to your listener. Don't make your listener have to pick up an EET when you could have instead made them pick up an ET. Now, my problem is, if you really want to be good to your listener, never elide. So I got the reverse of the other problem. You should never have ellipsis. But again, I think there's a trade-off between speakers and hearers there. But as long as there's going to be ellipsis, I think it makes sense to say that we already have, I think, some sort of at least tentative evidence that EET meanings are harder to access out of the blue, in that no one noticed them before. You have to go to a lot of lengths to do Zach and Keela type scenarios to construct them. Whereas missing ET type meanings out of the blue, we have lots of tested examples. So to say that it's harder to pick up missing two-place relations than missing one-place things, Stefan, you can, why don't we let him have the toes?
Sorry, I did it earlier.
So, you know, it makes sense to say that we have this independent evidence that the two-place relations are harder to just pull out of the blue, and therefore harder to access. Now, in this case, they're not being pulled out of the blue. They've been named in the antecedent clause, but they're still harder to access. So if we put it that way, I think we have a decent story that it's about type competition, not size competition. And I actually put in here, I have 4 minutes, so let me just say a few more things. So is the story clear? Is the basic story clear before I just go on to do a few more applications of it? So what this does, I should say, is crucial to have a variable-free apparatus. What does this have to do with what I did in the first 20 minutes of the talk? What I did in the first 20 minutes of the talk was try to give you an overview of variable-free semantics, which makes the claim that when you have an expression with an unbound pronoun within it, it's not a function from assignment functions to something else, but it's a function from individuals. That was crucial to saying that in these sort of SOG-like cases, what we're picking up is an EET meaning, because you've got in the antecedent, you're picking up the meaning of something like, let's do the South Carolina cases, the Lindsay cases, if you go back and look at 8A versus 8B. In 8B, you're picking up the missing two-place relation, seal the nomination for. And it's crucial that that's the missing thing, because it's crucial that the her in the first clause is just really, you know, like an extra argument slot that's waiting to be filled. In the good case, hoping that it seal the nomination for her, 8A, again, it's because you've bound up it's what you're picking up is Z hope that South Carolina will seal the nomination for. And that's to be an X who hopes that South Carolina will seal the nomination for X. So there you're picking up this missing ET meaning. But this story couldn't be told without this sort of different types that you get in variable-free semantics, where when there's a pronoun there, it kind of is this argument reducer in a sense. You get this extra more complex type. And so we can relocate the competition as a type competition, which I think has some psycholinguistic validity, as opposed to a size competition, which is really mysterious. There's no obvious reason why size should matter in terms of these competition effects. Let me just take maybe 5 more minutes, because we started 5 minutes late, just to walk through a couple of these other cases. First of all, there's Merchant's original case. So his case for MaxElide was something like, Sally will nominate someone for the post, but I don't know who is good, but Sally will nominate someone for the post, but I don't know who she will, is not good. That also follows on my story, because in the first one you're just missing modulo of the pronoun, which here could just be understood as Sally. You're missing an ET type meaning, and in B you're missing an EET meaning. However, I kind of think these are red herrings for reasons that Griffiths talks about. You don't get the right focus thing, so I won't say anything more about that. But there's an interesting case where type competition actually makes the correct prediction and size competition doesn't. And that's something like an 18. Bagels, I think that Sally really likes. Donuts, I also do. That's good. But it's also good to get the smaller ellipses. Bagels, I think that Sally really likes. Donuts, I also think she does. That's not much worse, if at all. In fact, there's some, I construct one in 19, where it's better to have the smaller ellipsis, because the bigger ellipsis leads to garden path effects. And so in this theory, whether you have the big ellipsis or the small ellipsis, it's both EET type things. In the size theory, 18A should quash out 18B, or 19A should quash out 19B. Let me read these. The hummus Sally had told me that Max had bought. The pound cake Sarah had. That's pretty bad, actually, on the relevant meaning. Or I mean, Sarah had told me that Max had bought. The hummus Sally had told me that Max had bought. The pound cake Sarah had told me he had. Still kind of awkward, but much better. So in that case, the little ellipsis is preferred because the big ellipsis leads to a garden path. But if it was a grammatical size-based thing, they shouldn't care about the garden path. Finally, there's a case that neither of us account for, but that's fine because it has nothing to do with this domain. And I mentioned that here. I will stop on that. There was a cool case that Merchant had, but it turns out to have to do with independent constraints on sluicing. I just will mention 4. There's an additional case which Takahashi and Fox and I both predict is good. I just want to mention that because I wrote bad on the handout, and that should say good. And I won't go into that. I'll stop. We can ask any of these in the question period if people want. But the one case I've been able to construct where we actually make different predictions, I think the type competition story works. But again, to tie this back to the beginning part, all this relies on A, the view that you're just picking up meanings in these ellipsis cases rather than silencing things. And B, this has to do with a sort of a psycholinguistic explanation that I can't really fully defend at this point, but seems plausible that the more complex the type, the harder it is to access them. But see, you get that type difference only in their variable-free semantics. You don't get that under the standard theory. So why don't I stop and we can have some questions, I hope.